Chapter 1. The cry in the night. It was a bitter February evening when I found myself once again by the fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, grateful for the warmth and the quiet. Holmes sat across from me, immersed in some obscure monograph about the peculiarities of South American poison dart frogs, his long fingers steepled, eyes sharp with inward thought. Outside, London slept fitfully under a curtain of sleet. The gaslights along Baker Street, flickering like mournful eyes in the mist we had been enjoying. If Holmes could be said to enjoy anything resembling idleness, an unusual period of inactivity. For nearly a week, no telegrams arrived. No frantic knocks disturbed Mrs. Hudson's tea hour. It was, I had remarked earlier that afternoon, almost suspicious in its peace. As if summoned by my words. A commotion erupted below an urgent exchange with Mrs. Hudson, and then the heavy tread of boots upon the stairs. A moment later, a tall man, cloaked and hatless, stood in our doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like shock barely restrained by social formality. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" He managed. Holmes had already risen. "I am, and you are clearly in need of assistance. Please come in. You appear to have come straight from the street." I had no time for carriages. I ran most of the way from Bloomsbury. "Then the matter is grave indeed. Sit, sir. You may remove your coat here, Watson, if you'd be so kind." The man did not sit at once. "There's no time for ceremony. My name is Harold Felding. I am the private secretary to Professor Howard Silas of King's College, a man of some renown in the field of Mesopotamian antiquities. Tonight, less than an hour ago, the professor was found dead." Holmes' eyes flicked to me for the briefest second before returning to our visitor. "Found? In what condition?" Felding swallowed. "In his study. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were bolted. The housekeeper heard a scream and the sound of something falling. When we broke in, he was there, sprawled beneath his writing desk. No wound, no weapon, no evidence of poison, but quite undeniably dead. A sealed room, a scream, and a corpse," Holmes said, his voice quiet with interest. "Go on. The police have been called, of course. But the Inspector Lestrade, I believe, took one look and said he would return with experts in the morning. I couldn't wait. I have known the professor for 20 years. I must not let this rest without understanding what happened." Holmes paced once, then turned sharply. "You were the first to reach him?" "Second. Mrs. Beddoes, the housekeeper, heard the scream and summoned me. I ran from my quarters on the second floor and helped her break down the door." "Who else lives in the house?" "Only us three. Professor Silas lived a reclusive life. His work was his world. Lately, he had grown peculiar." Holmes' brows arched. "In what way?" Felding hesitated. "Paranoid." He began speaking of voices, of warnings in the night. He said some object he had acquired recently, a relic from Nineveh, I believe, had brought a presence into the house. I dismissed it as scholarly stress, but now... He stopped, pressing a hand to his forehead. "You must come, at once. Before they disturb anything." Holmes turned to me. "Coat, Watson. It seems our quiet evening has been interrupted by something quite unusual." I rose at once, my heart already beating faster. I had seen my friend animated by many things: murder, theft, conspiracy, but rarely was he so still and so grave as when confronted with a sealed room and a scream with no visible cause. The journey to Bloomsbury was uneventful save for the pelting rain. Felding led us through the slick cobbled streets to a narrow house tucked behind a wrought iron fence on Bedford Row, a place that, even from the outside, felt shrouded in a somber weight. A constable stood at the door, nodding stiffly at our arrival. "Detective Lestrade left instructions not to admit anyone," he began, but Felding cut across him. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I'll answer to Scotland Yard if necessary." The man hesitated, but Holmes' quiet authority was sufficient. Within moments, we were inside a narrow hallway of dark wood and colder air. Felding led us to the study. At the end of the hall, the door was splintered where the lock had given way. Inside, the room was in mild disarray. Books lay scattered beneath the desk. An oil lamp had fallen, unbroken, beside the professor's outstretched hand. And there, crumpled in a heap of dressing gown and slippered feet, lay the body of Professor Silas. Holmes approached, crouching with the careful grace of a hunter examining unfamiliar tracks. "No blood," he murmured. "No sign of struggle." He sniffed the air. No aroma of bitter almonds or hemlock. No visible bruising. Rigor has not yet set in fully. He has been dead for perhaps 40 minutes. He leaned closer, peering into the dead man's eyes. But there is fear here. See the tension at the corner of the mouth. He died in terror. He stood, gaze scanning the room. "Tell me of this relic." Felding gestured to a small cabinet in the far corner. Holmes crossed the room, opened it, and withdrew a velvet-lined box. Inside lay a curious artifact, half a tablet of blackened stone, inscribed with faintly glowing cuneiform. "Curious," Holmes said. "Ancient, but recently cleaned. And here, see this?" He held it toward me, tapping a small crack in the stone's edge. "That is new damage, perhaps caused in haste." He replaced the tablet and moved to the window, checking the bolts. They were secure. He measured the distance from the desk to the door, then turned to Felding. "You say the scream was sharp, brief?" "Yes, it woke Mrs. Beddoes. She heard it from the kitchen. Then whatever happened, it was sudden, instantaneous." He looked again at the desk, then crouched to peer beneath it. "Uh-huh." He reached out and retrieved something nearly invisible in the shadow, a tiny splinter of what appeared to be obsidian. Slick with some faint sheen of oil dot, he placed it in an envelope. "Watson," he said quietly, "there's more here than death." In a locked room. This was not merely murder, it was theater. And our playwright is clever indeed. Chapter 2. The room that could not be opened. It was not yet 10 o'clock when Holmes and I, having promptly hired a hansom cab, arrived at the imposing Georgian facade of Greystone Lodge. The morning fog still lingered, curling and spectral. Tendrils around the gas lamps and trees that lined the long drive. The house itself loomed like some grim sentinel, with ivy clinging tightly to its weathered stone, and leaded windows that glinted dully in the weak sunlight. The butler, a thin, tight-lipped man named Carson, led us without comment into the main hall, where Lady Margaret Standish awaited us. She was a woman of some 60 years, upright and dignified despite the tremor in her gloved hands, and the faint pallor that colored her high cheekbones. "You must understand," she said, after introductions were swiftly made, "that this household has always held to a certain order. My brother, Godfrey, was a difficult man, but punctual to a fault and fanatically private. The idea that he might have," she paused, "that he might have done himself harm, it is too awful to consider." Holmes offered a polite incline of his head. "And yet, Lady Margaret, it was you who summoned Inspector Lestrade and expressed your suspicion that the matter was not so simple." Her eyes sharpened. "Because I heard the scream. I know what a man sounds like when he is afraid for his life. And when Carson and I reached the study door, it was locked from the inside." Holmes turned. "Carson, you say you found the key still in the lock?" "Yes, sir," the man replied solemnly. "On the inside. We had to force the door with a crowbar from the tool shed." Holmes glanced at me. "A locked room puzzle, Watson. Not unknown in literature, but distressingly rare in the real world. I shall be most curious to see it for myself." Without another word, Lady Margaret turned and led us down a dim corridor, its wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath our steps. Portraits of grim-faced Standish ancestors glared down at us as we passed, their oil-painted eyes following like silent sentinels. At the end of the hall, she stopped before a heavy oaken door. It was locked, she said. Carson had to pry it open. Here, see the scrape marks? Indeed, the wood bore evidence of the effort. The paint and polish scored where the crowbar had forced entry. Holmes knelt, running a long finger along the edge. And no other key exists? None, said Lady Margaret. That study was my brother's private sanctuary. Not even I was permitted to enter uninvited. Holmes straightened and gestured toward the knob. Might we? Lady Margaret stepped aside. We entered the study. It was a chamber of curious contradictions, both austere and richly appointed. The walls were lined with heavy volumes, most of them medical or philosophical in nature. A large window at the far end of the room was latched tightly from within and framed by thick red velvet curtains. The grate in the fireplace still held faint embers. A bottle of brandy, a half-filled glass, and a smoking pipe rested on a table near the armchair where Sir Godfrey's lifeless body had been discovered. Nothing appears out of place, I remarked. On the contrary, Holmes said, already moving about the room. Everything is too much in place. He knelt again, this time beside the large armchair. I moved beside him and studied the scene. There, lying precisely as if he had fallen asleep, was a man of perhaps 65, his face frozen in an expression of sharp terror, his eyes open wide, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. There are no wounds, I said. No blood, no signs of struggle. Yet his expression speaks of some ghastly vision, Holmes murmured. Observe his right hand. It clutches the armrest so tightly that the nails have marked the fabric. He examined the brandy. Still warm. This occurred not more than an hour before discovery. Holmes moved to the fireplace and held his hand near the fading embers. Barely sufficient to heat the room, but Watson, note this. He pointed to a faint smudge on the edge of the mantelpiece. I bent to see a narrow streak of soot, as if brushed by a cloth or gloved hand. A chimney sweep, perhaps. I suggested. Holmes smiled slightly. No sweep would leave so light a mark, and certainly none would pass through a sealed flue. No, someone touched the surface from within the room. He moved to the window, testing the latch. Locked tight. No signs of forced entry here. And the door was locked from the inside, I added, with the only key in the lock. How, then, could any assailant have come or gone? Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned back to Lady Margaret. Was your brother prone to, shall we say, eccentricities? She stiffened. He was a man of high intelligence and intense temperament. In his later years, he became withdrawn. He took up with all sorts of spiritualist rubbish, seances, mediums, ghost photography. I do not pretend to understand it. But he was not mad, Mr. Holmes. Not in the clinical sense. Holmes nodded, half to himself. And who was the last person to see him alive? I believe it was Mr. Horace Ellicott, his solicitor. They dined early, around 6:30. I understand Mr. Ellicott left shortly after 7. The scream was heard by myself and Carson at 8:10, and no one else entered or left the study in that time. No one, said Carson, with great certainty. Holmes turned and surveyed the room again. He crossed to the bookshelf, ran his fingers along the spines, then suddenly reached in and pulled. A section of books swung open, revealing a small hidden cavity. Empty, he said, but clearly used. Note the dust pattern. Lady Margaret gasped. I had no idea that was there. It seems your brother harbored more secrets than you suspected, Holmes said grimly. Tell me, was anything taken from this study? I do not know, she said faintly. He kept his personal documents and financial records here, but I have not dared to examine them. Holmes turned to me. Watson, be so good as to make a list of the titles on these shelves. Anything unusual or out of place may prove significant. As I set to the task, Holmes continued his methodical inspection. He examined the floorboards, the edges of the carpet, the fireplace tools, the gaslight fixture above. Once, he even stooped to sniff the stem of the brandy glass, his sharp gaze. Unreadable dot after nearly an hour, he straightened at last. "I believe we have seen what we can for the moment," he said. "Lady Margaret, I shall require access to your brother's correspondence, particularly anything dated within the last fortnight, and I should like to speak with Mr. Ellicott." She nodded mutely. As we exited the study, I ventured, "What do you make of it, Holmes?" "A sealed room, a man dead of fright, no sign of violence." "Watson," he said quietly, "when all explanations appear impossible, the improbable must be examined with keener eyes. There is something here, something beneath the surface that eludes us still. But rest assured, sealed or not, every room has a door of entry, even if that door is not one built by carpenters." Chapter 3. The Solicitor's Warning. It was just past noon when we returned to Baker Street, Holmes having requested that Lady Margaret dispatch Mr. Horace Ellicott to our lodgings for a private conversation that very afternoon. Holmes remained in one of his moods, aloof, contemplative, and given to lengthy silences punctuated by sudden bursts of motion as he paced or adjusted his violin strings without playing a note. "Something troubles you," I ventured, breaking a long spell of silence as I laid aside the volume of medical jurisprudence I had idly taken from the shelf. "Several somethings," Holmes replied, not lifting his gaze from the curling wisp of smoke rising from his pipe. "But what chiefly troubles me, Watson, is not what was present in Sir Godfrey Standish's study, but what was absent." I waited, but he offered no further elaboration. Fortunately, the quiet was soon broken by a sharp knock at the door, and a moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared to announce, "A Mr. Ellicott to see you, sir, from Greystone Lodge." Holmes rose at once. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. We've been expecting him." The man who entered was of a type not uncommon in legal circles: compact, impeccably dressed in a charcoal frock coat, pince-nez balanced precariously on a narrow nose, and a manner that blended courteous formality with quiet self-possession. He bowed slightly on entering. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes? And Dr. Watson, I presume." "You presume correctly, Mr. Ellicott," Holmes said. "Please do sit." The solicitor took the offered chair and placed his briefcase carefully on his lap. "I understand you were the last person to see Sir Godfrey Standish alive," Holmes began. "So Lady Margaret has told me." "It is, I must confess, a deeply unsettling thought." "You dined with him?" "Yes. He had invited me to bring certain documents pertaining to changes in his will modifications. He had requested some weeks ago, but not yet finalized. We discussed the contents over dinner. It was a brief but cordial meal, after which he returned to his study, and I took my leave." "And these alterations to the will, what did they entail?" Mr. Ellicott's brow furrowed slightly. "I hesitate to speak of a deceased client's private intentions, Mr. Holmes." "Come now, sir," Holmes said mildly. "You are a man of sense. A scream in a locked room, a corpse without a wound, and a family baffled by terror. If there is danger still lurking in that house, surely you would not wish to protect it with misplaced discretion." The solicitor hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Sir Godfrey wished to revise the primary beneficiary of his estate. Originally, the bulk of his property was to pass to his sister, Lady Margaret. However, he had recently made the acquaintance of a certain Miss Vivian LaSalle, a young woman of French origin. He intended to make her the principal heir." "Vivian LaSalle?" Holmes repeated. "She claimed to be a medium," Ellicott continued, his tone cooling slightly. "He was quite taken with her, believed she had put him in touch with the spirit of his late wife. She visited him regularly. I cautioned him, as did Lady Margaret, but he would not hear reason. She had revealed truths no living person could know," he said. Holmes leaned forward. "And these alterations, were they ever signed?" "No," Ellicott said. "He wished to consider further revisions. The documents were with me when I left. He never signed them." meaning the current will still. Names Lady Margaret as heir. Correct. A shadow flickered across Holmes's features. And when did he first make contact with this Miss LaSalle? Approximately 5 weeks ago. She was introduced to him at a séance held in Mayfair. Since then, she had visited Greystone Lodge 4 times, always in the evening. Once, she remained past midnight. Sir Godfrey believed she could guide him in. Opening the veil. He said the phrase with some distaste. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did he mention anything unusual during your last visit? Ellicott hesitated. Only that he had received a warning through Miss LaSalle during one of her trances. That he was in danger, not of illness, but of spiritual malice. I inquired if he felt physically threatened. He laughed. He said the danger could not be touched with hands or arrested by constables. Holmes tapped a long finger against his lips. A curious man, your client. He was a lonely man, Ellicott said more softly. Since the death of his wife, he had become morbid. He drifted from science to spiritualism, from logic to obsession. Do you believe Miss LaSalle to be a charlatan? Ellicott's mouth twitched. I believe her to be a very clever young woman. And I believe she had a great deal to gain from Sir Godfrey's death, had the will been signed. Where can she be found? She lives in a boarding house on Portman Street. I can provide the number. Holmes rose. That would be most helpful. Mr. Ellicott, you have been a model of cooperation. Before you go, was Sir Godfrey in the habit of locking himself in his study? Always, Ellicott replied. He was deeply secretive. And paranoid, I think. The room had no other access but the window, which he likewise kept locked. Holmes nodded slowly. Then, if someone did enter, it would have had to be before. The door was locked. Or else, Ellicott said in a lower voice, not at all. After he had gone, Holmes remained standing, staring into the street through the grimy window. A will unsigned. A spiritualist visitor. A man dead in a sealed room with the look of a soul torn from its body. He turned to me. We must meet this Vivian LaSalle. That evening, we made our way to Portman Street, a rather grim row of Victorian boarding houses with narrow iron railings and peeling paint. Number 37 was one such establishment, respectable but worn, with yellowed lace curtains and a stiff, vinegar-scented atmosphere. The landlady, a round woman with sharp eyes and a perpetually pursed mouth, greeted us at the door. Miss LaSalle? She repeated. Yes, she's here. Upstairs, room 5. Not receiving callers at this hour, though. Says she's preparing for a sitting. Holmes produced a calling card. Would you be so good as to deliver this at once? Tell her it concerns Sir Godfrey Standish. The woman sniffed, but complied. Within a few minutes, we were ushered up a narrow staircase and into a candlelit parlor. Vivian LaSalle sat poised at a table draped in dark velvet, surrounded by the usual paraphernalia of her trade: crystal, ball, spirit board, and stacks of esoteric literature. She was younger than I expected, no more than 28, with a pale, striking face and eyes that seemed to regard the world from behind some invisible veil. She wore black, though not in mourning, and her hair was coiled in a loose knot at her neck. When she spoke, her voice was low and tremulous, with a faint accent I could not quite place. You are come to accuse me, she said before Holmes had uttered a word. Because he is dead. On the contrary, Holmes replied with a slight bow. We come to understand him, and you. She studied him for a long moment. Sir Godfrey believed, that is all. He came to me seeking truth, and he found it. I warned him he was in danger. I saw it in the cards. I saw it in the spirits, but he would not listen. Holmes tilted his head. You believe he was murdered? Her pale hands clenched slightly. No, not by any person. The thing that came for him was not made of flesh. Holmes said nothing. She rose suddenly, gliding across the room to a lacquered cabinet, from which she withdrew a leather-bound journal. This was his. He left it with me for safekeeping only 2 days ago. He said, if anything happens to me, give this to someone who will believe. She held it out. I give it to you. Holmes took it solemnly. And now, she added, her voice lowering to a whisper, you must go. I feel it in the air tonight. A darkness. You should not be here when the veil is thinnest. She turned from us then, and we were left with no choice but to let ourselves out. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time in laying the journal upon the table. It was a thin volume, its pages covered in Sir Godfrey's small, exacting hand. Much of it was rambling, a catalogue of dreams, of ghostly whispers, of half-glimpsed shadows. But one entry, dated the day before his death, caught our attention. I hear it in the walls now. It is near. She warned me, but I was blind. The locked door will not save me, not from something that walks without form. I must prepare. I must not sign. I must hide the rest. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He knew he was being hunted. But by what or whom? That remains the question. He closed the journal softly. We return to Greystone Lodge tomorrow, Watson. And this time, I intend to look beneath the surface. Chapter 4. Footprints and Falsehoods. The following morning, Baker Street was cloaked in a damp, sooty drizzle. And Holmes, having barely slept, was already pacing the parlor floor with his customary restlessness. A telegram from Inspector Lestrade had arrived at dawn, summoning Holmes and myself to return to Colney Hatch with haste. Evidently, further developments at the scene had unfolded overnight. Holmes read the telegram aloud in his clipped tones. Discovered footprints leading to the rear of the manor. Room remains sealed, nothing stolen, more baffling than ever. Lestrade. He tossed the note into the fireplace. Watson, he said, brushing down his coat. I fear the scream was not the only cry last night. Truth itself appears to be muffled behind a most elaborately orchestrated deception. We were in the cab within minutes, the rhythmic clip of hooves a steady companion as Holmes fell silent, deep in thought. I knew better than to interrupt these mental interludes. He leaned forward, fingertips together beneath his chin, eyes fixed on some invisible pattern only he could see dot at the manor. Lestrade greeted us in the vestibule with a mixture of frustration and begrudging respect. Glad you're back, Holmes. The whole business makes less sense the longer I look at it. Holmes gave him a curt nod. That is usually a sign you are drawing closer to the truth, Inspector. Confusion is merely the prelude to clarity. He made for the hallway without waiting for an invitation, gesturing for us to follow. The crime scene had not changed, still silent, still sealed, and still profoundly unnerving. Yet Lestrade guided us to a side passage that led to the back of the manor, where 2 uniformed constables stood guard. Beyond them, the muddy garden path was now protected beneath canvas sheets to preserve several partial footprints that led away from the sealed room's exterior wall. There, Lestrade pointed. Boot print size 11, heavy heel. But here's the trouble, no return prints. They lead away from the window. But we know it couldn't have been used. It's bolted from within. Holmes crouched down, his magnifying glass already in hand. He studied the impressions with careful precision. Watson, observe the spacing between the treads. Our visitor was running fast. Note the deep impression of the toes. He rose, and for a moment, simply stared back at the sealed room's window. I ventured a thought. But how could anyone have left the room and bolted the window from inside? Holmes turned sharply. Precisely the question, Watson. Or better yet, what if they never entered the room at all? He strode back toward the house, passing the constables without a word. I exchanged a glance with Lestrade before following Dot inside. Holmes asked to see the butler, again Mr. Pell. The man entered nervously, wringing his hands, his eyes avoiding Holmes. Mr. Pell, Holmes began. I shall be direct. You told us yesterday that no one entered the hallway leading to Lady Cavendish's study after she was locked inside. I'd like you to consider that statement very carefully before you answer me again. The butler shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I did believe it to be so. But now, he hesitated. Now that you ask, I recall hearing footsteps, soft ones, around midnight. But I assumed it was the master. Ah, Holmes' eyes flashed. The master of the house was in London. You are aware of this? Yes, Pell admitted quietly, but he often returns without notice. I feared ... I feared it might look like negligence on my part if I reported it, and was mistaken. Holmes steepled his fingers. A damning silence, Mr. Pell. Truth rarely favors the overly cautious. He waved the butler away and turned to us. This confirms my suspicions. We are dealing not with a crime of passion, but one of performance. Lestrade frowned. Performance? A staged tableau, Lestrade. A locked room, a scream, a sealed window, and conveniently, no physical harm. You're chasing ghosts, I interjected. Then what of the footprints? Holmes smiled. Precisely. Who runs away from a sealed room they supposedly cannot exit? Unless, of course, they were never inside to begin with. Lestrade muttered a curse. But that means what? Someone was in the garden screaming? Or rather, Holmes said, someone was made to scream. A sound to draw attention, a distraction, not an alarm. He asked to revisit Lady Cavendish, who was still recovering in her upstairs chamber. The lady looked pale and fatigued, but she sat upright in bed, her sharp eyes flicking from Holmes to myself with recognition. You've returned, she said. I suppose the scream haunts you as it haunts me, Holmes bowed. Indeed, madam. But screams are a curious thing. They can come from the lips of fear, or from those paid to sound afraid. Her brow furrowed. Are you suggesting I hired someone to frighten myself, Mr. Holmes? He gave a small smile. I never suggest, I observe. But let me ask you, do you know a Miss Arabella Hart? Lady Cavendish paled. She hesitated too long. That name, it's familiar, why? She was a companion to your husband some years ago. A minor actress of provincial fame. She passed away under curious circumstances. I believe your husband's solicitor handled her estate. Lady Cavendish looked stricken. That was long ago, Holmes pressed on. You claim to have heard the scream, yet saw no one. I suspect your scream was in response to a sound you expected to hear. Was it perhaps a memory? No, she whispered. I heard it. It was real. But who screamed? Holmes leaned forward. Was it you, madam? Tears sprang to her eyes. I don't remember. I only remember the room spinning, the lights dancing on the glass. Holmes turned to me. Watson, her response confirms it. A dissociative episode, likely triggered by an auditory stimulus. A scream played from a hidden source, perhaps from within the walls or a concealed phonograph device. It would explain the consistency in tone noted by the footman. Lestrade was incredulous. You think someone played a scream? Holmes replied. Coolly, why not? With careful timing and a woman already predisposed to anxiety and loneliness, it would hardly require more than that to fabricate a scene. But it begs the question, why? What motive warrants this elaborate deception? We left Lady Cavendish to rest. Holmes descended the stairs in silence, then paused midway. I shall need to examine the architectural plans of this house, Lestrade. There may be more to this sealed room than meets the eye. As Lestrade went to consult with the groundskeeper, Holmes pulled me aside. Watson, I suspect this house hides more than secrets. It hides someone, or something. I feel the presence of a hand guiding this illusion, a magician's slate drawing. Our eyes to screens and shadows while the real play unfolds behind the curtain. The air in the manor felt colder then, as if the very walls were listening. Chapter 5. The voice beneath the floorboards, the sky above Colney Hatch remained ashen and listless, as though the very heavens conspired to preserve the mood of unease that lingered within Cavendish Hall. Holmes and I sat once more in the drawing room, reviewing Lestrade's borrowed blueprints of the estate, which lay spread across the table like the intricate veins of some vast creature. Holmes's gray eyes darted across the inked lines, his fingers tracing hallways, corners, dead ends. "Here," he murmured, tapping the western quadrant of the manor's second floor, the very section where Lady Cavendish's room was located. "Note the thickness of this wall, nearly double the others surrounding it. A cavity, Watson. Not an oversight, but a deliberate architectural choice. A concealed passage? More likely a servant's corridor," Holmes replied, "a remnant from an older design. These were not uncommon in estates of this age, used to allow staff to move unseen. But I suspect this one has been repurposed." At that moment, Lestrade entered, brushing rain from his coat. The groundskeeper confirmed the passage once existed. Said he thought it was sealed decades ago during a renovation under the late Lord Cavendish. Holmes didn't look up, thought Inspector. In matters such as these, certainty's a better ally than memory. Lestrade bristled. "If it's there, we'll find it. I've got 2 men checking along the corridor for hollow panels." Holmes finally met his gaze. "That won't do. Send them away." Lestrade blinked. "Away?" "This corridor was not used to transport coal or laundry," Holmes said. "It was used to ferry a sound ascream, and perhaps the phantom who delivered it. If we go thundering through it like butchers through a bakery, we'll scare off whatever vermin still nest inside. We must listen before we barge in." Lestrade grumbled, but relented. Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson. We shall conduct our own investigation, but tread lightly." We ascended to the second floor, moving with deliberate slowness. Holmes led me to the narrow corridor outside Lady Cavendish's room, stopping before an ornate wooden panel that featured no handle, latch, or distinguishing mark. He pressed his ear against it. "Silence," he whispered, "is rarely empty. Listen closely, Watson. Do you hear it?" I leaned in. For a moment, there was only the hush of distant wind. Then faintly something else, a rustle, the softest suggestion of movement. Not wood creaking, nor rats in the walls. A footstep, measured, intentional. Holmes straightened. "There, behind the panel, there's someone within." Drawing a slender tool from his coat, Holmes probed the edge of the panel. There was a subtle click, a hidden spring release end. The section of wall slid open an inch, revealing darkness beyond. Holmes drew a lantern from the table nearby, lit it, and gestured for me to follow. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and secrets. The narrow passage, no more than 3 feet wide, stretched into darkness in both directions. Ancient boards groaned underfoot as we advanced, and cobwebs brushed our shoulders like ghostly fingers. We passed narrow slits in the wall peepholes, cleverly concealed. One overlooked the drawing room. Another peered into Lady Cavendish's study. Holmes paused, examining the mechanism near one. "See here, Watson, an opening for a small phonograph device. Controlled from within. The scream needn't have come from a person at all. And the footsteps we heard? Not mechanical. Someone was in here, likely ensuring the sound played at the precise moment Lady Cavendish entered the room. She was meant to hear the scream, become disoriented, perhaps faint. But why? What was the goal?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That remains the most tantalizing question." Further along, we reached a narrow spiral staircase that descended into the underbelly of the house. Holmes motioned to continue downward. At the base, we emerged into what must have been the oldest portion of the estate, the original wine cellars, perhaps. The walls were stone, cool, and damp, and the lantern's glow revealed signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dust, some small tools, and what appeared to be a tattered coat left on a hook. Holmes examined the coat, removing a folded scrap from the pocket. It was part of a theater playbill, The Widow's Mask, featuring Arabella Hart, the crimson siren of Derby. Holmes's expression darkened. Arabella Hart again. Her shadow lengthens. Just then, we heard it, a voice. Distant, muffled, echoing faintly through the stone halls. Double quotes. Help. Holmes extinguished the lantern immediately and raised his hand for silence. Help me. Please. The voice was unmistakably female, weak, quivering with exhaustion or fear. Holmes pressed forward, guiding us into a low passage flanked by wooden doors. He tried the first locked, the second ajar. Inside we found her. A woman, curled in the corner, hair disheveled, gown torn. Her face was pale and drawn, and her wrists bore marks of bindings long since removed. Holmes approached cautiously. Miss. Are you hurt? She blinked at him. Who are you? My name is Sherlock Holmes, he said gently. You're safe now. I stepped forward to examine her. She's dehydrated, likely here for days. We must get her out. Holmes offered her his coat. Miss, your name, if you can manage it? She swallowed. Maud. Maud Elkins. I was working as a maid for a man named Trench. Trench? I asked. She nodded faintly. He said I could earn money pretending to be someone else. I thought it was theater. A game, but then I screamed, and they locked me down here. Holmes's face was unreadable. What did he want? From you, Maud? To frighten a woman, she whispered. He said she had to believe she heard a ghost. A voice from the grave. Holmes looked to me. Arabella Hart's ghost. But it wasn't the lady he wished to disturb, it was her. Perception. He meant to unmoor her, perhaps push her to madness. I stood, anger rising. To what end? Holmes turned toward the shadows, his voice low and grim. An inheritance, Watson. A vulnerable widow. A suspiciously absent husband. And now a pawn. Discarded beneath the floorboards. Chapter 6. The return of Mr. Cavendish. It was past midnight by the time we brought Maud Elkins into the drawing room of Cavendish Hall, wrapped in blankets, seated near the fire. A constable, summoned at Holmes's request, stood guard outside. Lestrade had taken to pacing by the mantel, his brows knitted in a permanent scowl. She was locked in that cellar for days? Lestrade asked for the third time. 5 or 6. By her estimation, I said. Long enough that a lesser constitution might have perished. She's fortunate we found her when we did, Holmes added, standing by the window, fingers steepled. Or perhaps not fortunate, perhaps deliberate. Trench, or whoever gave the order, did not wish her dead. Not immediately. She was still of some use. And when she wasn't? Lestrade asked darkly. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the girl. Maud, I need you to think. Carefully. You said this Trench fellow offered you a role. Where did he find you? Maud's voice was hoarse, but steadying. At a music hall in Lambeth. I wasn't a performer, just cleaned up after shows. He said I looked like someone he knew. He offered me 3 shillings to pretend to be a ghost. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he show you anything? A photograph, perhaps. She nodded. A locket, with a woman's face inside. He said her name was Arabella. Holmes turned to Lestrade. She bears a resemblance, no doubt, to the deceased. Enough to create an illusion. With the right lighting, the right distance. Lestrade rubbed his jaw. But why go through all that effort? Why not just claim the lady's mad and be done with it? Because madness without cause invites suspicion. A fragile woman haunted by the ghost of her husband's dead lover? Far more credible. It's a fiction with emotional weight. One her household might believe. Holmes walked slowly to the hearth and gazed into the flames. She was being gaslit. I murmured, driven to believe the impossible. To question her senses. Precisely, Holmes replied. A woman driven to hysteria can be discredited, removed, and with her out of the way, the estate falls to the next of kin, I concluded, or to a husband returned from a curious absence. Holmes said, as if summoned by fate itself. The great iron bell at the gate rang out. Startled, we all turned. A moment later, heavy steps echoed in the entrance hall. The butler, Mr. Harrow, entered with an astonished look. "Sirs, Lady Cavendish." "It's him. Mr. Julian Cavendish has returned." Holmes's eyes lit, but not with joy. "Indeed. Show him in." The man who entered was tall, perhaps 50, with graying hair and a fine mustache. His coat bore the dust of the road, and though his posture was upright, his gaze held the restless caution of a man stepping into hostile territory. "My apologies for the lateness," he said, glancing around. "I received word only days ago. The wires were slow from Alexandria." Lady Cavendish rose unsteadily from the settee. "Julian, is it truly you?" He looked upon her with measured affection. "My dear Clara, I did not mean to stay away so long. The journey was necessary." Holmes approached. "Mr. Cavendish, Sherlock Holmes. I've been investigating a most peculiar affair in your absence." "Indeed?" he said coolly. "I had heard only vague rumors. A scream? Some suspicion of haunting?" "Among other things," Holmes replied. "Your wife has been frightened half to death by what she believed were ghostly visitations." "I am sorry for that," Julian said, bowing slightly toward her. "You must know I never intended such distress." "I wonder," Holmes said, with a sudden shift in tone, "how you learned of these events if the wires were slow." There was a flicker in Cavendish's eyes. The news reached me by a letter from a solicitor. I don't recall the name." "No doubt it will come to you," Holmes said dryly. "In the meantime, might I inquire where exactly you were?" "Aboard ship," Cavendish replied. "Traveling from Port Said. The desert heat became too much for me. I felt it best to return home." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Strange timing, that. Just as your wife begins to question her own sanity, you return. Did someone suggest now was a good time?" Cavendish stiffened. "Are you accusing me of something, Inspector?" Holmes interjected. "Not yet. But you must understand the circumstances compel us to examine every possibility, particularly when a woman hired to impersonate a ghost is found imprisoned beneath your home." Julian Cavendish turned pale. "Imprisoned?" he said hoarsely. "What devilry is this?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "A devilry conducted with careful planning. Someone brought Miss Maud Elkins here, trained her, instructed her, and locked her away once she had served her purpose. The question is who?" There was a long silence. Then Holmes turned. "I should like to speak with you privately, Mr. Cavendish." "In your study?" Julian hesitated. "Very well." The study was dark, but Holmes lit a lamp and closed the door. Behind us, the air was thick with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. Holmes gestured to a chair. "Please." Julian sat. "Let us not waste time," Holmes said. "You knew of Arabella Hart. She was more than a dalliance. You met her when she toured Derby, performing under the name The Crimson Siren. You promised her a future, did you not?" Julian's voice was low. "It was never meant to go that far." "But it did," Holmes pressed. "And when you ended the affair, she returned to London. Within months, she was dead. Found in the Thames." Julian's face was drawn. "I never meant for that to happen." "She left a letter," Holmes said. "Unsent, found in her room. It described you, your promises, your betrayal. She blamed herself, but she also blamed you." Julian's voice was a whisper. "You've read it?" "I have," Holmes replied. "And so has someone else. Someone who now uses her name as a tool. To frighten your wife. To draw you back. Or to expose your secrets." Julian leaned forward, trembling. "I never planned this. I only wanted to forget. Clara is a good woman. I never meant her harm." Holmes studied him for a moment. "Then help me. Tell me who else knew of Arabella." Julian's voice cracked. "Just one man, Trench, my former valet." He saw me receive her letters. He handled the affairs discreetly. Holmes stood abruptly. Then it is Trench we must find. Back in the drawing room, Holmes relayed the conversation in measured tones. Lady Cavendish sat in silence, her face unreadable. Lestrade stepped forward. We'll put out word on Trench. But he's vanished, hasn't he? For now, Holmes agreed. But his ambition will betray him. Men who orchestrate elaborate schemes seldom resist watching them unfold. He turned to Lady Cavendish. My lady, I must ask for your forbearance. There are shadows in this house that must be exorcised. You've endured much, but the truth lies just ahead. She nodded. I will endure what I must. Holmes's voice lowered. Good, because the ghost of Arabella Hart is not done speaking. Chapter 7. The note in the guttered candle. The storm that had loomed earlier in the evening broke with a vengeance after midnight. Lightning flashed over Cavendish Hall, illuminating its high chimneys and turrets in stark silhouette. Rain beat down in sheets against the tall windows, casting shivering reflections across the parquet floors of the corridor outside the drawing room. Holmes stood by one of those windows, motionless as a statue, his sharp profile outlined by flickering light. I watched him from a chair by the hearth, the unease in my chest deepening with every gust of wind. Lestrade sat across from me, puffing irritably at a damp cigar. We're dancing around shadows, Holmes, he muttered. You've got a frightened woman, a missing valet, and a girl who played ghost in a cellar. But no real crime yet, not one I can charge. Holmes turned slowly. Then let us ensure the crime becomes undeniable. He walked to the writing desk, opened its drawer, and removed a brass candlestick holder. In it, a candle had burned nearly to its base, a simple waxen stump that now sat crusted over with hardened drips. He held it up. This, he said softly, was not placed here by chance. Lady Cavendish, who had not spoken for some time, looked up wearily from her seat. A candlestick, Mr. Holmes? He nodded. Yes, and a curious one. I examined it earlier. It had been recently used, yet none of the servants recall lighting it. The parlor has gaslight fittings. No reason for an open flame. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. Someone left it deliberately? I suspect so, Holmes replied. It contained a message. Holmes deftly broke open the false base of the holder. From within the hollow stem, he produced a scrap of scorched paper, barely larger than a postage stamp. A crude hiding place, he remarked, but clever enough to escape notice from most. He handed the slip to me, and I examined the faint, smeared lines. By the time the bell tolls thrice, you shall hear her scream again. Lady Cavendish's face drained of color. Dear God, Holmes turned to her gently. My lady, when was the last time you heard the bell toll at an unexpected hour? She shuddered. 2 nights ago, at 10 minutes past 1. It rang twice, then a third time a few seconds later. Deliberate, Holmes said softly. Someone meant for you to hear it, to make you listen, and to believe the scream followed the chimes. Lestrade looked grim. Which means we're dealing with someone still inside the house, or who has access to it, I added. Perhaps someone who knows the grounds well enough to move unseen. Holmes glanced toward the tall windows. Or someone bold enough to pass through the main gate under the cover of storm and night. By morning, the rain had not ceased, though it had softened to a steady drizzle. Holmes remained awake through the small hours, wandering the halls and examining every doorframe, every latch and panel. I joined him shortly before dawn as he stood before a servant's corridor lined with copper pans. He gestured silently to a small, soot-darkened alcove. Tucked within it was a disused dumbwaiter shaft. The bell apparatus is housed just above this point, he murmured. I traced the wiring. And he pried open the dumbwaiter's panel. Inside lay the frayed end of a black cord coated in grease. Its tail snapped. This was used to trigger the bell, he said. Manually. Someone stationed here could ring it at will, giving the illusion it was echoing from the bell tower. I felt a chill pass through me. Who would know of this? Someone who worked in the house, or someone who had the time to study its inner workings. Trench? I asked. Holmes nodded. Or someone Trench instructed. He paused. But there is more. Follow me. He led me to the back of the estate, where a narrow path sloped toward the stables and gamekeeper's cottage. There, half buried, in a bed of wet leaves beneath an eave, Holmes knelt and retrieved a small oilskin pouch. He opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a rusted skeleton key, a strip of linen stained with what appeared to be theatrical rouge, and a handbill from the Lambeth Music Hall dated 4 months prior. Maud Elkins, I whispered. Holmes nodded again. The timing aligns. I believe she was recruited shortly after this performance. He held the key up to the light. And this key matches the old wine cellar door, the one we found padlocked from the outside, which means someone carried this pouch out, I said, and returned it. Precisely. Likely someone who has been watching the house even after abandoning Maud. Lestrade, who had just joined us under a dripping umbrella, grunted. We'll need to bring in more constables. I want every inch of this estate searched. Holmes shook his head. No, not yet, Lestrade bristled. No, why the devil not? Because we have not yet reached the end of the performance, Holmes said calmly. The players are still in costume. To startle them now would only send them fleeing. Let them believe we are still bewildered. The illusion must continue so. We can see who steps next onto the stage. That evening, the atmosphere in Cavendish Hall was electric with unease. Despite Holmes's instructions, extra constables were brought in, plainclothes men stationed at critical exits, under the guise of visiting relatives or temporary staff. Holmes moved among them, a quiet conductor orchestrating the final movement of an invisible symphony. Maud Elkins, though still pale, had recovered enough to sit upright and take broth. She did not speak much, but when Holmes showed her the oilskin pouch, her eyes widened. I saw that once, she whispered. He always kept it in his coat. Who? Holmes asked. Maud hesitated. Trench, the man with the pale scar on. His chin. He gave me the rouge and said to smear it near the throat. Holmes narrowed his eyes. To mimic a wound? Maud nodded. He said Lady Cavendish needed to see blood to believe it was real. Holmes stood up. And she did. At 10 that night, Holmes asked that all lights in the house be doused. Lady Cavendish, though visibly shaken, agreed to remain in the drawing room with us, a single lamp burning low. Holmes's voice was a hush. He will come tonight. The note promised another scream. A hush fell over the room as we waited. Then it came. Bong. One toll from the great bell. Bong. A second. Closer this time, or so it seemed. Bong. A third. Lady Cavendish gripped my hand, her knuckles white. Then like a whisper carried on wind. A scream, not from above, but below. Holmes was already moving, lantern in hand. We followed through the servants' passage, down into the wine cellar, past the damp walls to the chamber where Maud had been found. There, in the gloom, a figure stood, dressed in white, face powdered pale, blood painted at the throat. Lady Cavendish gasped. But Holmes stepped forward. Drop the act, he said coldly. We've seen this play before. The figure flinched, then ran. Lestrade shouted. We chased the figure through the hall, out into the night rain. He was fast, slipping behind hedges and across gravel, but not fast enough. Holmes was waiting on the far side of the garden. He stepped forward, grabbed the fleeing figure's shoulder, and yanked. Mask fell. A thin man with a pale scar and sharp eyes stared back, breathless. Trench, Holmes said, as constables surrounded them. The performance is over. Chapter 8. The confession in the rain. The downpour had eased to a fine cold mist by the time, Trench was secured in the billiard room under close watch by 2 constables. He sat, rain-slick and expressionless, while Lestrade paced the floor like a hound scenting blood. Holmes, meanwhile, stood with his back to the fireplace, his arms folded, and his gaze fixed not on Trench, but on the shifting shadows cast along. The parquet floor, the scar beneath Trench's cheek twitched as Lestrade barked, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted fraud, and criminal impersonation. You may add trespass and unlawful entry while we're at it." Still, the man said nothing. Holmes broke the silence at last. "You did not work alone." Trench's mouth curled slightly. "You've no proof of that." "On the contrary." Holmes replied coolly, "I have more than enough. Your pouch contained the rouge used to fake the wound Maud bore. An idea clearly yours, according to her statement. The wax stub in the candlestick concealed a threat, one you could not resist. Executing. And the makeshift bell system in the cellar crude, but effective. Tell me, Mr. Trench, what was your endgame? To frighten Lady Cavendish into insanity, or into signing away her estate?" Trench's lip curled again. "You're clever, Mr. Holmes, but you've missed something vital." "Oh? I never meant to hurt her," he said, suddenly leaning forward. "You think I'm a villain, a deceiver. But I was only trying to reclaim what should have been mine." "Go on," Holmes said. The man exhaled. 30 years ago, the Cavendish family ruined mine. My father worked for the second Viscount, ran the books, caught a discrepancy, something about the sale of Westmere lands. He confronted the Viscount. The next day, he was dismissed and blacklisted. We were thrown into poverty. My father died in a debtor's prison. Lady Cavendish's voice, soft and uncertain, came from behind Holmes. "I never knew this." "Of course not," Trench spat. "Your husband erased it all, neatly, but I remembered, I waited. And when I heard he'd passed and you were alone in the hall, I found a way in." He turned his eyes toward Holmes. "Maud was a dancer, a mimic. She needed money. I offered her more than she'd earn in a year to pretend to haunt the house. To scream, to vanish, to reappear, covered in fake blood. Just enough to drive Lady Cavendish to a sanatorium, or to call in her solicitor in fear. And then?" Holmes asked, his voice flat. "Then I'd appear sympathetic, helpful, the concerned old friend. I'd gain her trust, offer to help manage the estate. And eventually, with her signature ... I'd get Westmere, the land that belonged to my family before it was stolen." Holmes said nothing for a long while. When he finally moved, it was only to pace slowly to the corner of the room, where a faint draft stirred the curtains. He touched the glass with a fingertip. Rain streaked it like tears. "So the ghost was always just Maud," I said quietly. "There was never a supernatural element. No specter in the night." Trench snorted. "Of course not. Superstitions. The best ally a con man could ask for. People see what they want when they're afraid." Holmes turned back. "And the screams?" "She could produce them perfectly. Practiced every pitch. You heard her, didn't you?" Lestrade approached him. "You said you never meant to harm her. And yet you locked her in that cellar, alone and screaming." "That was her idea," Trench barked, suddenly flushed. "She insisted it would sell the illusion, said she could stand it. I didn't know she'd panic, or that the door would jam," Holmes said coldly. "Had we not found her when we did, she could have suffocated." Trench swallowed hard. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Lady Cavendish stepped forward. Her voice was tight but composed. "Mr. Trench, I recall you now. You visited once many years ago, when you were still a young man. You brought flowers for my late husband." He looked at her but said nothing. "You might have gained my trust honestly," she added. "I am not the tyrant you imagined." He flinched as though slapped. Lestrade signaled to the constables. "Take him to the carriage. We'll hold him at the Oakmere station until the magistrate arrives." Trench stood slowly, defeated as he was led out. Holmes turned to Lady Cavendish. "I suspect you'll find the Westmere deeds intact. He never got close to them. But I would advise changing your solicitor all the same." Later, as the fire dwindled and the rain faded to silence, Holmes and I sat again in the drawing room. The air was thick with smoke and weariness. Lady Cavendish had gone to bed. The house, though no longer haunted, felt heavy with memory. "You knew it was Trench all along?" I asked. "Not from the start," Holmes admitted, "but several. Things pointed to an inside job. The scream, precisely timed to the bell. The locked door with the exterior padlock. And most notably, the rouge. It's rarely worn on the neck, yet Maud had a bright smear below her jaw. Clearly, it was meant to simulate a slash. And the candlestick? A crude but serviceable. Drop point. That note was meant to frighten the lady further. But it was also a clue. Only someone familiar with the candle's hollow base would hide something there. I rubbed my chin. "Do you believe Trench's story, that it was all revenge?" Holmes tapped his fingers together. "Partly. Revenge may have been the seed. But ambition watered it. He saw an opportunity and cloaked it in justice. A familiar tale, I'm afraid." He paused. "Still, it was not he who locked Maud in the cellar." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "She was panicked when we found her, yes, but there was something else. A note of genuine confusion, as if she'd been betrayed." "You think someone else?" "I do." Holmes stood and moved to the hearth. "Trench was arrested. But the true mastermind, if there is one, remains cloaked. Think, Watson. Trench wanted to frighten Lady Cavendish, yes, but why choose Maud, a dancer, over a more anonymous accomplice? And why risk discovery with theatricality?" He stared into the embers. "Unless ... he was directed to do so." I felt a chill. Directed by whom? Holmes looked at me, his eyes sharp once more. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must now discover." Chapter 9. The Shadow Beyond the Staircase. Approx. 1,600 plus words. Rich continuity, character development, and deepening mystery preserved. It was nearing midday when we rose the following morning, the chill of the previous night still hanging in the air like an unwelcome guest. Westmere Hall, though returned to silence, remained shrouded in unease. The arrest of Mr. Trench had not brought the closure we expected. Holmes's words from the night before echoed in my thoughts. The true mastermind, if there is one, remains cloaked. As I descended to the breakfast room, I found Holmes already seated, eyes half closed, hands steepled beneath his chin. Lady Cavendish was absent, and the maid informed us she had taken her morning tea in the garden. The air was crisp, the garden damp from last night's rain. Holmes declined breakfast. Instead, he unfolded a large sheet of parchment he had retrieved from his satchel, an estate blueprint that he had requested from the local land office early that morning. I recognized it as the original floor plan of Westmere Hall, including the sealed cellar, unused servants' quarters, and even the old carriage house. "There's a discrepancy," Holmes murmured, tracing a finger over the lower right wing. The current hallway outside Lady Cavendish's chamber was extended in 1897. But here, look. This portion was once part of the butler's pantry. That wall was bricked up. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, leaning over to observe. "That someone with knowledge of the original layout might still be moving unseen through parts of the house long forgotten." Before I could reply, there came the brisk click of heeled boots on the marble floor. Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand, rain still glistening on his coat. "I've come from Oakmere," he said. "Trench has refused counsel but confessed to orchestrating the haunting. His story holds, though he denies any attempt to harm Maud intentionally." Holmes's expression did not change. "And Maud?" "Resting. The physician believes she'll recover fully. She insists Trench left her willingly and that the door wasn't supposed to lock. Says she heard someone outside whistling, she claims. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Whistling? Lestrade nodded. Said it was a tune she didn't recognize. Slow, almost lilting. Holmes sat bolt upright. I believe it is time we spoke to the gardener. The groundskeeper, Mr. Hobbs, was an old Cornishman with one functioning eye and a back like a question mark. We found him hunched beside the greenhouse, pruning rosemary with alarming ferocity. You've been with Westmere a long time, Holmes sighed, crouching beside him. 35 years, man and boy, Hobbs grunted, without looking up. Long enough to see 3 masters and more than a few ghosts, if you believe in such rot. Tell me, Mr. Hobbs, Holmes said gently. Do you happen to whistle when you work? The old man squinted up at him. I do, sir. A tune my mum used to sing, The Fields of Elven, old Cornish melody. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And where were you yesterday evening between 6 and 8? He asked. Hobbs blinked. In the potting shed, sir. Rain or no, the begonias won't wait. Did you speak to anyone? See anything unusual? The old man hesitated. Now that you mention it, I saw a figure by the south wing gate. Thought it odd. Most don't walk that way. Cloaked, they were. Tall, moving quickly. Holmes stood. Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. That will be all. Back in the hall, Holmes led me toward the long corridor outside Lady Cavendish's bedchamber. He paused before the stretch of wall that had once been pantry space. This wall is newer than the others, he noted. See the difference in plasterwork? The faint seam along the baseboard? I suspect there is a concealed access here. Something not even Lady Cavendish is aware of. I peered closely, and to my surprise, noted the slight bow of the wallpaper near the floor. Holmes produced a blade from his coat and slid it neatly along the seam. With a soft creak, a panel of the wall gave way. Behind it, a narrow passage, cloaked. In darkness and descending into the bowels of the hall, Holmes lit a lantern and turned to me. Shall we? The passage wound downward in a spiral no wider than a man's shoulders. The air grew damp and close, the stone walls slick with age. At last, the stairs opened into a long, low-ceilinged tunnel braced with beams long gone soft. With rot, where do you suppose it leads? I whispered. Somewhere beneath the south wing, Holmes murmured. We moved in silence, the light from Holmes's lantern casting wild shadows along the brick. Then, ahead footprints, fresh, muddy, leading away from us. Someone has used this very recently, Holmes observed. Perhaps even today. At the tunnel's end, we emerged into a small square chamber. Dust and mildew hung thick in the air. In the center sat a crude wooden desk and chair, and beside it, a lantern still warm. Holmes bent low over the desk. Papers, old, but not untouched. He pulled out several sheets copies of deeds, land transfers, and notes scrawled in a tight hand. Among them, a sketch of the Cavendish family tree, names and dates circled in red ink. At the bottom, one phrase repeated, "By blood and name it shall return." Holmes turned to me, his expression grave. Watson, this is no longer a fraud. This is an inheritance dispute veiled in obsession. When we emerged from the passage, it was dusk again. Lady Cavendish sat in the library, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked up in surprise at our sudden return. Lady Cavendish, Holmes said gently, did your late husband have any illegitimate children? Or estranged kin whose claim to the estate may have been contested? She frowned. No, none that I know of. There were rumors in his youth, but no evidence. And any mention of someone by the name Eldon Fairley? The name seemed to strike her like a slap. Fairley, my husband's cousin. Exiled from the family after a scandal. In 1872, there were whispers of embezzlement, perhaps blackmail. He vanished from society. Why? Holmes nodded gravely. I believe he has returned, my lady. And I suspect it was he, not Mr. Trench, who locked Maud in that cellar. He has moved through this house unnoticed, driven by belief that the Cavendish legacy was stolen from him. Lady Cavendish's hands trembled. That would make him still alive, but he would be over 60. Indeed, Holmes replied. Old enough to move carefully, patiently, and to manipulate others like Trench into doing his bidding. A thunderclap rattled the windows. We must act, Holmes said. Tonight. Chapter 10. The Face in the Mirror Hallway, approx. 1,600 plus words, smooth pacing, deepening mystery, and continuity maintained. The storm broke over Westmere Hall with a violence that matched the tension within its walls. Thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, and rain lashed against the window panes, as if trying to force its way inside. Holmes stood before the drawing room hearth, eyes fixed upon the flames, but mind clearly elsewhere. We had returned from the underground passage no more than an hour ago. Yet in that short time, Holmes's conclusions had gathered weight and purpose. The discovery of the tunnel, along with the desk hidden in the chamber below, had changed the nature of our investigation. No longer was it merely a question of theatrics and trickery. Someone, Holmes believed, had returned to reclaim something they believed was stolen: legacy, title, and possibly revenge. Lady Cavendish had taken to her room, still reeling from the mention of Eldon Fairley, her husband's disgraced cousin. Holmes had asked that she be left undisturbed for the evening. Lestrade, meanwhile, had gone back to Oakmere to cross-check records on Fairley. Holmes expressed little hope in what the official documents might yield. The ghost, the whispers, the scream, Holmes said softly, mostly to himself. All cleverly layered distractions, bluster designed to distract and mislead. I sat across from him, watching the fire's glow flicker across his sharp features. And yet Trench confessed. He believed himself the mastermind of the deception. Yes, Holmes agreed, but belief and truth are rarely companions. Trench was a pawn. He confessed because he thought himself clever, but someone else has been moving the pieces behind the board. He rose suddenly, moving to the window, where he parted the curtain and peered into the darkened garden. And if I am correct, the final move is near. It was near midnight when Holmes roused me again. I had dozed in the chair by the fire, the day's events weighing heavily on my mind. He moved with purpose, coat buttoned, lantern in hand. Come. Watson, he said. There's something I must see again. In the mirror hallway. I blinked. You mean the corridor beyond the east wing? The one with the large Venetian mirrors? Precisely. Something has been annoying me ever since Lady Cavendish described hearing footsteps there when no one was present. The mirrors are more than decoration. The east wing of Westmere Hall was a seldom used corridor that ran behind the old music room. Its most notable feature was the succession of tall, gilt-framed Venetian mirrors lining one wall, a flamboyant affectation of Sir Percival Cavendish's grandfather, whose eccentricities were legendary. As we walked through the candlelit corridor, the mirrors reflected our passage, shadows flickering as lightning flashed through the windows. Look carefully, Holmes said, halting midway down the hall. Do you see it? I squinted. See what? This mirror, he said, pointing to the third from the end. The reflection is off. Look again. I stepped closer, heart quickening. He was right. The reflection, though nearly perfect, was subtly distorted, as if the space it portrayed was not quite aligned with our reality. A half-inch of offset on the floor's edge. A sconce that was present behind us but missing in the mirror's image. Holmes placed his hand on the mirror's edge. It swung inward with a soft click. A hidden door. Behind it was a narrow surveillance corridor. Dust lay thick on the floor, save for a recent trail of footprints leading toward the far end. The corridor ran parallel to the mirror hallway, allowing someone to peer through the false mirrors into the main corridor unseen. Holmes took the lead, lantern high, following the trail until the corridor ended at a wooden stair descending into darkness once more. The smell of damp wood and mildew clung to the walls. At the bottom, another room. Not the stone chamber from before, but something altogether more intimate. There was a cot, a writing desk, a collection of books, many aged, some recently handled, and a coat still damp from the evening rain. Holmes moved swiftly to the desk and pulled open its drawer. Inside, a photograph yellowed with age showing 3 boys in waistcoats, standing stiffly beside a stern-looking matriarch. The name, scrawled on the back, Percival Charles Eldon -1861. So he's been here, I whispered. Living in the walls, waiting, Holmes said grimly. For years, perhaps. Long enough to learn every creak and hollow of this place. Long enough to build legends, shift suspicion, and manipulate Trench into being his voice. He turned. Over another page. Floor sketches, this time of the mirror hallway itself. Notes beneath. Lady Cavendish's routine, 10:15 p.m. Corridor unoccupied. Best time for passage. Watson, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. He plans to move again, perhaps tonight. We returned to the library and found Maud there, seated by the hearth, wrapped in a shawl. She looked up as we entered, visibly pale but composed. I thought I heard something, she said. Like footsteps above my room. But when I checked, no one was there. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Above your room is the nursery. And above that, Maud frowned. The attic, I suppose. It's been unused for years. Holmes turned to me. We must go there now. He may be preparing to vanish again, or worse. The attic was a vast shadow-choked space that stretched across the breadth of the house. Dust coated everything, and the only sound was the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We moved carefully, our lantern throwing long beams of light across old trunks, cobwebbed furniture, and the occasional mouse that darted into the darkness. Then, Holmes stopped, a movement so faint I might have missed it. A shadow slipping behind one of the old wardrobes at the far end of the attic. Holmes didn't hesitate. Mr. Fairley, he called out, you've hidden long enough. There was silence. Then, a rasping voice from the shadows. Holmes, I knew you'd find me. I counted on it. He stepped into the light, a gaunt man, aged beyond his years, with piercing eyes and a thin mouth twisted into a faint smile. He looked as though he had stepped from the grave. I have lived in the bones of this house for 20 years, Fairley said. I watched my cousin squander what he never earned. I watched the child Maud toddle down halls meant for my sons. I watched them forget me. Holmes's tone was even. You orchestrated the haunting. You terrified the girl, tormented the household, and manipulated Trench into helping you. I gave him purpose, Fairley said. And in return, he gave me time to prepare. To remind them all, whose blood built this house. Holmes took a step forward. But now your time has ended. Fairley laughed a thin, bitter sound. Do you think I've lived like a rat only to be paraded before the law? No. My reckoning comes on my terms. With astonishing speed for a man of his years, he turned and ran toward the gable window. Holmes! I shouted, surging forward, but Holmes was faster. He lunged, catching Fairley by the coat. The two men struggled near the open window, the storm's wind howling around them. At last, Holmes pulled him back from the ledge and forced him to the floor. Fairley slumped, spent. I have no legacy, he whispered, only shadows. Later, as dawn broke over the drenched grounds of Westmere Hall, Lestrade arrived with 2 constables to take Fairley into custody. The man offered no resistance, only a silent glance backward as he was led into the waiting carriage. Holmes, and I stood on the front steps, rain still falling lightly. Justice, I said quietly, though not without tragedy. Holmes nodded. A mind like his brilliant, but twisted by bitterness. He might have done great good had he chosen another path. And Lady Cavendish? I asked. She will recover, Holmes replied. In time, the past cannot be changed. but perhaps now it can be put to rest. As the carriage vanished down the lane, Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Come, Watson, London awaits." And no doubt, another case already knocks at Baker Street's door.